Hello and welcome back to this beautiful Sunday. We will be doing Walt Disney, an American Original, Section 5, Chapter 26. The wall of Walt Disney's conference room was dominated by an aerial map of Disneyland. Next to it was an enlarged reproduction of Variety's annual list of the biggest money-making films of all time. By the early 1960s, 7 of the top 50 were Disney pictures. 1 or 2 more joined the list each year, as Disney grew more dominant in the field of family movies, which the major companies had largely abandoned. "I put that up there to study what are the big movie moneymakers," Walt said to a reporter as he studied the list. "Most of them aren't the sensational pictures with a lot of sex. They're attractions for the whole family." Walt was careful to avoid any film material which might be offensive to families. He strayed from his principle only once. In Bon Voyage, he permitted a scene in which an attractive Parisian girl propositioned Fred McMurray at a sidewalk cafe. "I caught hell for it," Walt said. "Never again." In 1964, Walt Disney produced the greatest of his successes, Mary Poppins. The project had its beginnings 20 years before, when Walt picked up a book on the bedside table of his daughter, Diane. "What's this?" he asked. She explained that it was a collection of stories about an English nanny who could fly. Walt read the book and recognized immediately that it was Disney material. The author, P.L. Travers, didn't agree. She was an Australian lady who had lived in England and had taken her son to New York to escape the London Blitz of World War II. Walt asked Roy, who was going to New York in early 1944, to call on Miss Travers and express the company's interest in acquiring the Mary Poppins stories. We had a very nice talk, and she seemed glad to see me," Roy wrote to his brother. "She said in years back she was a contributor to several English magazines, and on a couple of occasions she had written about Disney pictures." Miss Travers told Roy that she owned the copyright, but her American publishers had an interest in what she did in motion pictures. "I had a hunch that this was a stall at the moment, for the way she said it didn't seem logical to me," Roy said. "It seemed to me that she was fencing." Roy added in his letter, "Miss Travers says she could not conceive of Mary Poppins as a cartoon character. I tried to tell her that this was a matter that should be left for future study, that it might be best for Mary Poppins to be produced in a combination of live action and cartoon, using the animation to get the fantasy and illusion of the Mary Poppins character. I told her that we were thoroughly qualified and equipped to produce either medium, and as a matter of fact, are producing such types of pictures." Walt followed up Roy's visit with a letter to Miss Travers inviting her to visit the studio and discuss what a kind of production she had in mind. She remained interested but non-committal. That continued to be her attitude over the years. When Walt visited England during the making of his first live-action films there, he paid a call at Miss Travers' home in London and discussed the filming of Mary Poppins over tea. Still, she refused and relinquished the movie rights. It was not until 1960 that Miss Travers finally agreed to deal with the Disneys. By this time, Walt's eagerness for the property had grown so acute that he paid an extraordinary price. He gave her approval of the screen treatment. Robert Stevenson, who had proved with Old Yeller, the absent-minded professor, and In Search of the Castaways, to be the most serviceable of Disney directors, declared himself to be the obvious choice to help prepare and to direct Mary Poppins. After all, he had been a boy with an English nanny in an upper-middle-class family in Edwardian England. Bill Walsh, who was to co-produce, and Don DeGrady, a veteran Disney storyman, were charged with devising a script from the series of Travers stories. Once again, Walsh employed a technique which had proved successful. He injected Walt Disney into the script. The father of the London family became the important figure instead of the mother, and he was instilled with the same qualities Walsh recognized in Walt. Mr. Banks was outwardly a strong-willed person, though he was soft underneath. He was cunning, resourceful, and got along well with the children, and he was always in trouble with the bank. Walt assigned Robert and Richard Sherman to write the songs for Mary Poppins. They returned in 2 weeks with sketchy versions of 5 songs that could fit into the script, including Feed the Birds and Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Walt liked them, especially Feed the Birds. "That song will replace Brahms' Lullaby," he declared, and he cried every time he heard it. The Sherman brothers were told to work closely with DeGrady, and Walt gave them an office near his. "Anytime you want to talk to me, call my secretary and come on over." Mrs. Travers made 2 journeys to Burbank to view the storyboards for Mary Poppins. She objected to many of the liberties that had been taken with her characters, and adjustments had to be made. Walt Disney exercised his own considerable powers of persuasion to win Mrs. Travers' approval. By the time she returned to England, she seemed convinced that the Disney innovations had originated in her own books. Walt closely followed the writing of the script, making contributions from his intimate knowledge of London. He had become an Anglophile during the making of his 4 English features and in his revisits of London. He loved to prowl the old streets, visit antique shops and apothecaries, and chatting with the proprietors. Once he pressed an unwilling Lily into his search for a Disney street. When they finally found it, Lily was amused to learn that it had once been called Dunghill Lane. Walt was fascinated with the buskers who made a precarious living by entertaining in pubs and on the London streets. He introduced the idea of having Bert, Mary Poppins' exuberant friend, make music as a one-man band. Walt remembered the chalk artist who drew scenes on the sidewalk in front of the National Gallery, and the script included Bert's sidewalk mural. Walt also suggested a fantasy sequence in which horses leaped off a carousel and raced through the countryside. During the planning stages, Bill Walsh and Don DeGrady sought a theme for the chimney sweeps dance atop the London roofs. They explained their need to Peter Ellenshaw, the British-born matte artist and designer whom Walt had brought to the studio after his work on Treasure Island. Ellenshaw described a ritual he shared with other students during his college days in London. Returning from a day at the city, the young men stopped at pubs along the route back to the city. After a pint or 2, they locked arms and performed a dance to the tune of Knees Up, Mother Brown. It consisted of raising knees as high as possible, then racing to the other side of the pub. The owner usually ejected the roisters because of the disruption. "Can you do it for us?" Walsh asked. Ellenshaw could and did. Walsh and DeGrady were charmed by the exuberant dance, and they hastened to show it to Walt. This time, both Ellenshaw and DeGrady performed it in Walt's office. "Hey, that's great," Walt responded. "Let me try it." Now the 3 men plunged across the room, knees high, to the chant of Knees Up, Mother Brown. Walt immediately sent for the Sherman brothers and demonstrated the dance to them. They were assigned to write an adaptation of the old song, and they produced Step in Time in half an hour. It proved the background for the liveliest number in Mary Poppins. Walt's total control of the script process can be seen in the various drafts of Mary Poppins' screenplay. The pages are marked by the familiar Disney handprint as he made additions and deletions in the scenes, and the opening sequence of the first draft screenplay, dated July 12, 1961, these emendations appeared. "Camera follows Mr. Banks down street on his way from work. Let him open door on the upset household Nana's dialogue. It's not only the children, but the adolescent adults, etc. The cook and the maid should be peeking outdoors at this scene, eliminating screams of Jane and Michael. This makes kids brats. Let Nana Kate do all the screaming. She is packed in such a hurry that some of her clothes stick out of the bag. Mr. Banks' bowler, umbrella, and briefcase are very English. Mr. Banks brings money home an evening in his briefcase, takes his lunch to work in it each morning. Of the exchange between the departing Nana and Mrs. Banks, we see all of this through Mr. Banks' eyes. Mr. Banks hangs up bowler hat and umbrella and carries briefcase and evening paper. Substituting dialogue. Mr. Banks, what, another position? Nana, yes, to get a little rest, I have just accepted a position in a lunatic asylum or boiler factory. Good day, Mr. Banks. Mr. and Mrs. Banks compose an advertisement for a new nanny. As Mrs. Banks starts to read it back, dissolve the front page of London Times, which is all want ads. Camera zooms in to Mr. Banks. Ad. Mrs. Banks continues to read, or a chorus of nannies' voices reading the complete advertisement. Dissolve to morning shot. Exterior Banks house with scores of nannies, etc. Walt's editing continues throughout the script, changing a word of dialogue, eliminating whole scenes, adding visual touches. Subsequent versions of Mary Poppins receive the same treatment. A script dated December 31st, 1962 contains comments on almost every page. Play to camera. They forget camera and play to each other. Bad taste. Eliminating a line about the cook's cold. Wheezing and drizzling like a broken dredge pump. Is this the only use of a kitchen set? Use mechanical robins here. Do we need Mary in this? This is sad. Use later. Would Mary have a nanny? Father would sing part of this. Background music. Tuppence, the bag. Mrs. Travers had portrayed Mrs. Mary Poppins as a middle-aged woman, and Walt first considered Bette Davis for the role. But as the score by the Sherman brothers developed, it appeared that the role would require a singing actress. Mary Martin was a candidate, but she decided against a return to films. Walt began thinking that Mary Poppins could be played by a younger actress, and he was receptive when his secretary, Tommy Wilk, suggested Julie Andrews, who had starred in the musical My Fair Lady and was then appearing on Broadway in Camelot. He asked to see film of Andrews and was told that a screen test she had previously made had been destroyed. It had made her seem unsuitable for movies. Walt attended a performance of Camelot on his return from Europe late in 1961. He was impressed by her stage presence, her beauty, and her clear, lyrical soprano. He was overwhelmed by her loud, sure whistle in the number, What Do the Simple Folk Do? He met her backstage after the performance and proceeded to relate the entire plot of Mary Poppins. She was impressed with such attention from Walt Disney, but she was not certain that she wanted to make her film debut as a flying nanny. On February 26, 1962, Walt wrote Andrews, "We would still like to have you consider playing the role of Mary Poppins in the Pamela Travers story, and I've just asked our casting department to contact your agent to see if some workable arrangements can be made. As it is difficult to visualize a story of this type from a written script, I thought you might fly out to Hollywood the early part of June, and then you could sit down with us and get a first-hand idea of what the finished story will be. We can play the songs, lay out the storyline, and I'm sure after seeing this sort of presentation, you will be able to make your own decision. We definitely feel in our own minds that with your talent, you would create an unforgettable Mary Poppins, and we hope you will want to portray this wonderful character after you have seen the presentation, which we can have ready for you in June." Andrews and her husband, Tony Walton, came to the studio after she completed her contract for Camelot. She saw the storyboards and heard the Sherman Brothers songs and liked the material, although she had some reservations. She returned to England to await the birth of her first child. Walt wrote her on June 22nd that the go-ahead from you and your manager to start negotiations on Mary Poppins made all of us very happy. In the meantime, we are revamping Mary, putting in better songs, and the story is shaping up much better. Your helpful criticism has inspired the boys to dig in, which I feel is going to pay off very well. So before long, we will have a new approach to the story. A girl named Emma Kate was born to Julie and Tony Walton in November, and they came to California in February to begin preparations for Mary Poppins. Walton was assigned to design the costumes in the film. Andrews' agreement with the studio stipulated that she would be released from the film if Warner Brothers should cast her as Eliza Doolittle in the movie version of My Fair Lady. Jack L. Warner, who was producing the film, chose Audrey Hepburn instead. With Julie Andrews cast as Mary Poppins, Walt sought an American actor for the role of Bert, the cheerful chimney sweep. Walt didn't want the film to be too British, and mixtures of accents never bothered him. He had successfully cast Hayley Mills as an American girl. When Dick Van Dyke was suggested for Bert, Walt admitted he had never seen him on television. He viewed the segment of the Dick Van Dyke Show in a projection room and decided immediately to cast Van Dyke as Bert. Ed Wynn, whom Walt had used in several comedies, was assigned to play the eccentric Uncle Albert. The rest of the cast was mostly English. David Tomlinson, whom Bill Walsh had seen in a British comedy, Up the Creek. Glynis Johns, who had appeared in Sword in the Rose and Rob Roy. Hermione Baddeley, Reginald Owen, Elsa Lancaster, Arthur Treacher, and two talented youngsters, Karen Dotrice and Matthew Garber. The filming of Mary Poppins, although lengthy, proved to be as smooth and pleasant as had been the making of Dumbo. Some of the sequences were designed for combination live action and cartoon, and Walt instructed Robert Stevenson not to concern himself about the animation. That would be filled in later. "Don't worry," Walt said. "Whatever the action is, my animators will top it." He was challenging them, and they knew it. Walt made a habit of walking through the sets after they had been built, searching for ways to use them. Bill Walsh described a visit by Walt to the Banks' living room in search of reaction to the firing of Admiral Boome's cannon. Walt got vibes off the props. As he walked around the set, he said, "How about having the vase fall off and the maid catch it with her toe? Or let's have the grand piano roll across the room and the mother catches it as she straightens the picture frames." In the early stages of production, Van Dyke was being tested in various makeups for later sequences. To relieve the boredom, he delivered snatches of comedy routines. One of them was his impression of an aged man desperately striving to step down from a sidewalk curb without injury. When Walt viewed the test in a projection room, he decided immediately to cast Van Dyke as the antediluvian Mr. Dawes, board chairman of the bank, and build a 6-inch riser on the boardroom set. Walt instructed, "So Dick can do that stepping down routine." Mary Poppins was premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood on August 27, 1964. The industry audience responded with cheers, and Walt realized that he had hit of immense proportions. He was enjoying the triumphant glow at the post-premiere party when Miss Travers approached him. "It's quite nice," she began. "Miss Andrews is satisfactory as Mary Poppins, but Mr. Van Dyke is all wrong, and I don't really like mixing the little cartoon figures with the live actors. When do we start cutting?" Walt smiled indulgently. "The contract says that when the picture is finished, it's my property," he replied. "We aren't going to touch change a thing." Movie critics, many of whom had deprecated the post-war Disney films, devoted columns to praise to Mary Poppins. Bosley Crowther wrote in the New York Times, "The visual and oral felicities Disney and the company have added to the sparkling film, the enchantments of beautiful production, some deliciously animated sequences, some exciting and nimble dancing, and a spinning musical score make it the nicest entertainment that has opened at the music hall this year." Judith Crist in the New York Herald Tribune, "The performers surpass even the technical wizardry of the film. Miss Andrews is superb at song and dance in the heart of the matter." Hollis Albert in Saturday Review, "One of the most magnificent pieces of entertainment ever to come from Hollywood." Even Disney-hating Times magazine conceded, "To make a good show better, Disney employs all the vast magic-making machinery at his command. The sets are luxuriant, the songs lilting, the scenario witty but impeccably sentimental, and the supporting cast only a pin-feather short of perfection." Although he claimed to be indifferent to critical response, Walt Disney could not conceal his pleasure at the outpouring of praise. The box office figures mounted astonishingly, and in its first release, Mary Poppins amassed worldwide rentals of $44 million. Walt was delighted when the film drew 13 Academy nominations. It was the first time that a Disney movie had contended in the leading categories. My Fair Lady won the Oscar as Best Picture of 1964, but Julie Andrews had evoked sympathy by being overlooked for the film version of Eliza Doolittle role she had created, was named Best Actress for her role in Mary Poppins. Walt refused to entertain suggestions for a sequel to Mary Poppins, clinging to his old theory that you can't top pigs with pigs. To devote a year or two of his creative life to a sequel was unthinkable. "Time is getting on, and I still have things left to do," he remarked. "I don't want to go back and cover the same ground." The extraordinary success of Mary Poppins prompted renewed awe for the achievements of Walt Disney. While he enjoyed recognition of his talents, Walt distrusted an excess of praise. Among his associates, he responded with an expletive. In the presence of strangers, he was polite but uneasy. One noon, he entertained a group of industrialists at his table in the commissary, and they were extravagant in their praise of Walt Disney. Don Tatum recognized Walt's discomfort and tried to relieve the situation by remarking, "Well, Walt, there's only one thing left for you to do, and that's to walk on water." Walt's eyes twinkled and he answered, "I've already tried that and it doesn't work." His creative touch extended to everything, from a new cartoon feature based on Kipling's The Jungle Book, to a projected Disneyland attraction, The Haunted Mansion, to a musical film based on the Broadway play The Happiest Millionaire. He even found time to write an original story for a film to star Dick Van Dyke, Lieutenant Robin Crusoe, USN. The idea came to him on an airplane, and he jotted the plot down on a scrap of paper. Later, he insisted on screen credit for his contribution. It read, "Original story by Retlaw Elias Yenzid," a backward version of his own name. With all his activities, he found time for small kindnesses. He had invariably sent notes of condolences to friends and employees whose parents died. When old schoolmates and teachers and business associates from his Midwest years wrote him, he responded with long, reminiscing letters. He supported many charities, particularly those that benefited children. He maintained a warm relationship with St. Joseph's Hospital across the street from the studio, donating to fund drives and ordering decorations of the children's wing with Disney characters. Christmas was a time of trial for Walt's secretaries. He maintained a file of hundreds of children of his personal friends, members of the press, studio workers, film executives, etc. To each child went gifts of Disney character merchandise, one important item apiece, plus a few little ones. The gifts continued until the children reached the age of 12, then he or she was dropped from the list and received a Christmas card instead. Walt's secretaries were charged with assembling the packages, and each had to be wrapped separately. A room in a studio warehouse was converted to a Santa's workshop, and Walt dropped in to inspect the packages and make sure that his specifications were observed. Walt usually left his family shopping until a day or two before Christmas, and his secretaries were enlisted to help. Often he settled on expensive perfumes for Lily and their daughters. Finding gifts for him was a recurring problem. After opening packages, he often grumbled, "I don't need that." One year, his daughters presented him with a handsome volume of the complete works of Leonardo da Vinci. "What are you trying to do? Educate me?" he muttered. But later that day, Sharon and Diane saw him in a corner poring over the book. Walt often found more delight in the simplest of gifts than the lavish presents from industry leaders. Hazel George had a good sense of what would please the boss, and she rarely spent over $1. One Christmas, she gave him a dime store kaleidoscope, and it fascinated him. He insisted that visitors to his office peer at the changing patterns of light and color. He enjoyed sharing his enthusiasms with others. When Robert Stevenson and his son were journeying eastward on the Santa Fe Super Chief, the director was surprised to receive an invitation to ride in the locomotive. Knowing that Stevenson was a railroad buff, Walt had arranged the treat with the president of Santa Fe. In the 1960s, Walt acquired a new toy, a company airplane. Since his activities were taking him all over the country, he concluded that a private plane would prove a convenience. As he did with most projects he contemplated, he ordered a survey by Harrison Buzz Price, the Stanford Research Institute executive who had been encouraged by Walt to form his own company, Economics Research Associates. The survey established the wisdom of Walt's plan for a company airplane, and he made the proposal to Roy. Roy thought it a bad idea, and Walt countered by saying, "Well, I've got a little money, I'll do it myself." Roy finally agreed to the purchase of the Beechcraft Queen Air. Walt took delight in planning each trip, plotting the itinerary on maps in his office over his evening scotch. When passengers arrived at the plane's home base at Lockheed Airport, he loaded their luggage aboard. During the flight, he served the drinks and supervised the galley. For years, Walt had yearned to pilot a plane, and on occasion, the company pilot, Chuck Malone, allowed Walt to take over the controls. Walt insisted that Ron Miller and Bob Brown learn how to land the plane in case of emergency when they were flying with their families. After Chuck Malone became ill while piloting the plane alone, Walt established the rule that 2 pilots would be required during all flights. Walt was determined to overcome Roy's opposition to the plane, and he planned a trip to the redwood country of Northern California and to Sunny Valley, Idaho for himself, Lily, Roy, and Edna. Roy was an uneasy passenger at first, but Walt persuaded him to assume the role of navigator. Roy, who had served as navigator in the Navy in World War I, took over the task with enthusiasm, and he became a convert to the company plane. Walt was convinced that the plane was an efficient tool for the company, not merely a frill for the executives. He grew more impatient with the claims of bankers and journalists that he was a profligate. He firmly believed he was not. He chastised producers who exceeded their budgets, and he was always seeking means to cut down production costs. Walt kept himself apprised of the company's fiscal matters by means of a weekly memorandum he received from Orban V. Mel Melton of the business department. Each Friday, Melton sent Walt a message consisting of 3 subjects written in capital letters, followed by a single sentence. Melton's succinctness was purposeful. He realized that Walt would not take the time to absorb anything longer. Usually, the 3 sentences contained enough information, rarely more detailed explanation. While he respected the financial needs of the company, Walt refused to be limited by them. At a meeting to discuss some major changes in Disneyland, Mark Davis, who had worked on the plans, began his presentation by saying, "Well, I've got an expensive way and a cheap way of doing this." Walt rose from his seat and walked to where Davis was standing. Placing a hand on Davis's shoulder, Walt said, "Mark, you and I do not worry about whether anything is cheap or expensive. We only worry if it's good. I have a theory that if it's good enough, the public will pay you back for it. I've got a big building full of all kinds of guys who worry about costs and money. You and I just worry about doing a good show." At Disneyland began its 10th year, it had grown from 22 attractions to 47, from an investment of $17 million to $48 million. 42 million people had passed through the main gate. Walt and Roy Disney appeared at a 10th anniversary dinner attended by those who had helped them build Disneyland into one of the showplaces of the world. Roy was characteristically modest in his remark to the audience. "Well, a lot of you probably don't even know me or didn't know me, but I have been here, and along with the rest of you, I've had my nervous moments too. But it has been a wonderful 10 years, and while we have the public to thank for their wonderful attendance, we also have to thank you people that were the key gang in handling that public and in giving them satisfaction, pleasing them and making them come back like they have, and having the word of mouth go round the world as it has. I've seen in my travels far and wide that the reputation of Disneyland stands out primarily, even beyond the show itself, for the courtesy of the people handling the public, and the cleanliness and friendliness of the place. I've always said in my end of the work that it takes people to run a business. You people have been the heart and soul of the business, and we appreciate it no end. And we say congratulations to you for doing the grand job that you've done all these 10 years. Walt was in a mellow, reminiscing mood when he spoke. He talked about hiring the singer Donald Novis to appear in the Golden Horseshoe Review, and how Novis recommended a young comic he had worked with in Australia, Wally Bogue. Walt recalled his first meeting with Joe Fowler, the retired admiral, and how little by little we sort of got him trapped into taking over the building and operating of Disneyland. Walt continued, "Well, we had a lot of problems putting this thing together. There was pressure about money. A lot of people didn't believe in what we were doing, and we were putting the squeeze play where we could. I remember that we were dealing with all 3 networks. They wanted our television show, and I kept insisting that I wanted this amusement park. And everybody said, 'What the hell does he want that damn amusement park for?' And I couldn't think of a good reason except that I wanted it. ABC needed a television show so damn bad that they bought the amusement park. Well, 5 years later, my brother figured we better buy those guys out. They had a third interest. They had only $500,000 invested in that park, but my brother figured if we don't buy them out now, we're going to be paying them a lot more later. He paid them, after 5 years, $7.5 million for their $500,000 investment, and it was a smart move. Well, my brothers had the worries of getting this money and fighting the bankers and things, and there was a time, I think it was after we opened the park, that our banker said to my brother, 'About that amusement park, we're not going to let you put another nickel into it.' And my brother said, 'Well, if you're going to start running our business, we're going out and find another place to borrow money.' And by gosh, they finally gave him the money. But it's been nip and tuck. I mean, when we opened, if we could have bought more land, we would have. Then we would have control, and it wouldn't look too much like a second-rate Las Vegas around here. We'd have a little better chance to control it. But we ran out of money, and then by the chance we did have a little money, everybody got wise to what was going on, and we couldn't buy anything around the place at all. This time, after 10 years, I want to join my brother and thank you all who have been here with us and have been a part of making this thing come across. But I just want to leave you with this thought, that it's just sort of been a dress rehearsal, and that's where we're just getting started. So if any of you start to rest on your laurels, just forget it." Honors continue to shower on Walt Disney. The highest came on September 14th, 1964, when President Johnson presented him with the Medal of Freedom at the White House. Walt flew east in the company plane with a few of his lawn bowling cronies from Palm Springs. They paused for a lawn bowling tournament en route, then went on to Washington. Walt had ample time before the ceremony, so he asked his driver to stop at the Lincoln Memorial. Walt stood before the heroic statue of Lincoln for minutes, reading the measured words carved in marble as his eyes filled with tears. Then he went on to the White House, where Lyndon Johnson gave him the nation's highest civilian honor. The citation, "Artist and impresario, in the course of entertaining an age, Walt Disney has created an American folklore." The accomplishments of Walt Disney impressed even his own grandchildren. He delighted in telling the story of how he and Lily were babysitting with the children of Diane and Ron Miller when thunderstorms struck down during the house. The children came scrambling to the grandparents' bed, and one of them pleaded over a clap of thunder, "Turn it off, Grandpa!" He related the story to Hazel George during one of their therapy sessions. She replied, "And did you?" Walt grunted and said, "You know what my next project's going to be? An audio animatronic nurse." Thank you for your time today. I really look forward to seeing you each and every Sunday. We only have a few more chapters left, but I really appreciate everything. Think about what we've done over the last few months and know that you're important to me. Take a time and enjoy today, tomorrow, and the future. Today's special moments are tomorrow's memories.